The combat simulation chamber stretched out before Megan Cole like a vast arena carved from metal and light. Its walls humming with energy as holographic. Projectors warmed up for what would be the most important test of her life. She stood alone in the center of the room, her standard-issue combat suit feeling too thin against the cold, recycled air of Orbital 7, the massive space station where the Galactic Defense Fleet trained its warriors from across 100 different worlds above. Or on an elevated platform sat the instructors who would decide her fate. And not one of them looked at her with anything resembling confidence or hope. Commander Veltris was the first she noticed. An 8-foot reptilian Thalaxian whose scales shifted between dark green and black depending on his mood. And right now, they were the color of dried blood, which she had learned meant irritation or boredom. Beside him sat Sub-Commander Drawn, a Khazari with 4 arms that moved independently as he tapped notes into his evaluation tablet, his compound eyes reflecting Megan's tiny figure below like she was an insect he might soon swat away. The third instructor was Overseer Yalith, a Neruvian whose pale skin seemed almost translucent and whose large dark eyes never blinked. A telepath sent by the Galactic Council to observe and report on human performance in these trials. Megan had heard that Neruvians could read thoughts as easily as humans read books. And the idea of someone flipping through her mind made her stomach twist with unease. Candidate Cole, Commander Veltris announced, his voice booming through the chamber speakers. You are attempting the Advanced Combat Certification Trial, a test that has been administered to warriors of the Galactic Defense Fleet for over 3,000 years. He paused and looked down at his tablet before continuing. You are the 14th human to attempt this trial since your species was granted provisional membership in the fleet 15 years ago. And you should know that none of your predecessors have passed. Megan kept her face neutral, even though her heart was pounding so hard. She could feel it in her throat. She had known the statistics before she ever applied. Had studied the reports of every human who had tried and failed. And she had told herself that she would be different, but standing here now with 3 alien instructors staring down at her like she was already a disappointment. That confidence felt very far away up in the observation deck behind a thick window of reinforced glass. Nathan Perry pressed his hand against the surface as if he could somehow send his support through to his friend below. He was scheduled for his own trial next week. And watching Megan face this alone was almost harder than facing it himself would be. She can do this, he said quietly to the woman standing beside him. Admiral Grace Lawson did not look away from the chamber below. Her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her Earth Defense Coalition uniform crisp, despite the long journey to reach this station. She can, the Admiral agreed. But they are not going to make it easy for her. And we both know that easy was never part of the plan. Nathan wanted to ask what she meant by that. But the trial was beginning, and all his attention snapped back to Megan in the chamber below. The first wave of holographic enemies materialized around the edges of the room. Humanoid shapes in dark armor, carrying weapons that glowed with simulated energy. Commander Veltris spoke again, his tone flat and procedural. The trial consists of 5 waves of increasing difficulty, and you will be evaluated on technique, efficiency, form, and adherence to established combat protocols recognized by the fleet. Megan shifted into a fighting stance. But even as she did it, she could see Sub-Commander Drawn's forearms moving as he marked something on his tablet. Too wide, she guessed, or maybe too low. Or perhaps humans simply stood wrong by galactic standards, and nothing she did would ever look right to these aliens. First enemy charged at her, and she reacted on instinct, ducking under its swing and driving her elbow into where a human's ribs would bait. Hologram flickered and vanished, marked as a kill, but above her she heard Overseer Yalith make a soft sound of disapproval. Sloppy, Sub-Commander Drawn commented, not bothering to lower his voice. No precision in the strike, no follow-through. She moves like prey that got lucky. Megan heard him and felt heat rise in her cheeks. But she forced herself to focus as two more enemies approached from different angles. She had trained for this her entire adult life, had spent years in Earth's military academies, learning everything humanity knew about combat. And she was not going to let their words break her concentration. The next few minutes became a blur of motion and reaction as she fought through the first wave, taking down enemy after enemy with techniques she had practiced until they were burned into her muscle memory. But every time she glanced up at the instructors, she saw the same expression on their faces, disappointment mixed with a kind of tired confirmation. Like she was proving exactly what they had expected when the first wave ended, and she stood, breathing hard, in the center of the chamber. Commander Veltris read out her scores in a voice that carried no emotion. Technique: 42% of optimal efficiency, 51% form, 38% protocol adherence, 29%. He looked up from his tablet, and his dark eyes met hers across the distance. These scores are below the passing threshold, Candidate Cole, and while the trial will continue, you should be aware that recovery from this deficit is statistically unlikely. Megan swallowed hard and nodded, not trusting her voice to stay steady if she tried to speaking the observation deck. Nathan turned to Admiral Lawson with fear in his eyes. "She is failing," he said. "They are going to wash her out before she even gets to the hard parts." Admiral Lawson finally looked away from the window and met his gaze with an expression he could not read. "The trial has only just begun," she said, "and I have learned that humans have a way of surprising people when things look the most hopeless." Below them, the second wave began to materialize, and Megan Cole raised her fists and prepared to fight again, even though every number on those tablets said she had already lost. The second wave was harder than the first, and Megan felt the difference immediately as the holographic enemies moved faster and struck. With greater coordination, she blocked a blow that would have taken her head off and spun away from a second attacker, her boots scraping against the metal floor as she struggled to find her footing above her. Sub-Commander Drawn's forearms never stopped moving as he recorded every mistake, every imperfect angle, every moment where her form failed to match the thousands of years of refined combat techniques that the fleet considered proper. She drops her guard when she kicks, he observed to Commander Veltris. Any trained warrior would exploit that opening and end the fight in seconds. Commander Veltris nodded. His scales, now a dull gray that Megan had learned, meant boredom or resignation. "Humans are a young species," he replied. "They have had barely 10,000 years to develop their combat arts, while the Thalaxians alone have refined our techniques over 200,000 years of warfare." Overseer Yalith said nothing, but her dark, unblinking eyes remained fixed on Megan, as if she was trying to see something that the others were missing. She reached out with her telepathic senses, attempting to touch the human's mind and understand what drove her to keep fighting when the numbers already spelled defeat. But human thoughts were strange and chaotic, nothing like the ordered mental patterns of other species. She had encountered all she could sense from Megan was a swirling storm of emotion that felt like fear and desperation, and something else she could not quite identify. Interesting, Yalith murmured to herself, though she did not share her observations with the other instructors. In the chamber below, Megan took a hit to her shoulder that sent pain shooting down her arm and made her gasp. The combat suit registered the damage, and her score dropped another few points as the simulation counted it as a potentially disabling wound. She gritted her teeth and kept fighting, refusing to let the pain slow her down, but she could feel her energy draining with every passing minute between waves. As the holographic enemies dissolved and new ones prepared to spawn, she allowed herself a moment to close her eyes and remember her training back on Earth. Her instructor had been a man named Sergeant Kevin Brooks. a scarred veteran who had survived 3 wars and walked with a permanent limp from an injury that had nearly killed him. He had never taught her to fight with elegance or precision. He had taught her to survive. Listen to me, Cole, he had told her once after a particularly brutal training session. Out there in the galaxy, they have been fighting for longer than humanity has existed. And they have turned combat into an art form with rules and techniques that take lifetimes to master. He had leaned close, his eyes hard and serious. But here is what they do not understand about us. We did not evolve to fight beautifully. We evolved to not die. And when everything else fails, that is the only thing that matters. Megan opened her eyes as the third wave began, and she threw herself back into the fight with his words echoing in her mind, but the instructors saw none of the memory that drove her. They only saw a human candidate who flailed and scrambled and refused to adopt the proper forms. She is not even attempting to correct her mistakes. Sub-Commander Drong complained. I have provided feedback through the speaker system, and she ignores it completely. Perhaps humans lack the cognitive capacity to adapt in real time, Commander Veltris suggested, making a note on his tablet that would go into her permanent file in the observation deck. Nathan Perry watched his friend take hit after hit, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. This is not fair, he said through gritted teeth. They are judging her by standards that were never designed for humans. Admiral Lawson stood beside him with her arms crossed, her expression calm even as Megan stumbled and barely recovered from what should have been a fatal blow. You are correct, the Admiral said quietly. The evaluation criteria were developed by species who have had millennia to refine their combat arts. And humans have only been part of the galactic community for 15 years. Then why did you push so hard for us to be included in these trials? Nathan demanded. Why set us up to fail? Admiral Lawson turned to look at him, and something in her eyes made him step back. Who said anything about failing? She asked, and before he could respond, she turned back to watch the trial. The third wave ended with Megan's scores even lower than before, and Commander Veltris announced the numbers with the same flat tone he had used since the beginning. Cumulative score now stands at 34% of passing threshold. Candidate Cole. At this point in the trial, no candidate in recorded history has ever recovered to achieve certification. He paused and exchanged a look with Sub-Commander Drawn before continuing. The fourth wave will now begin. And while you are permitted to continue, the outcome is no longer in question. Megan looked up at the instructors, sweat dripping down her face and her chest heaving as she fought to catch her breath. She could see the dismissal in their eyes, the certainty that she was nothing more than another failed human experiment, another data point proving that her species did not belong among the warriors of the galaxy, but somewhere deep inside her, beneath the exhaustion and the pain and the creeping despair, something else was waking up. It was the same thing that had kept her ancestors alive on a planet that tried to kill them every single day. It was the same thing that had driven humanity to crawl out of caves and conquer a world that was never meant to be conquered. And it was the same thing that whispered to her now, telling her that she was not done yet. The fourth wave materialized around her, more enemies than ever before. Moving with deadly speed and perfect coordination, Megan Cole raised her fists one more time and prepared to show them what humans were really made of above her. Overseer Yalith suddenly leaned forward, her telepathic senses detecting a change in the human's mind that she had never encountered before. The fear was still there, but it was being pushed aside by something older and darker and far more dangerous, something that made even a Neruvian telepath feel a chill run down her spine. Commander, she said softly. Something is different now, but Commander Veltris was too busy marking deductions on his tablet to notice the warning in her voice. The simulation ended with a soft chime that echoed through the suddenly silent chamber. and Megan stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the fading light of 20 defeated holographic enemies. Her breathing was ragged, and her body ached in places she had not known could hurt. But she was still standing. She was still alive above her on the platform. The three instructors remained frozen in place, their eyes wide and unseeing as their minds struggled to process what they had just experienced. Overseer Yalith was the first to regain control, and she did so with a shuddering gasp that sounded almost like a sob. "Ancestors preserve us," she whispered in a voice that trembled. "What are these creatures?" Commander Veltris came back to himself a moment later, his scales cycling through colors so rapidly that they seemed to blur together. He tried to speak, but found that his throat had closed up, and he had to swallow several times before words would come. "I felt it," he said hoarsely. "I felt what she feels. I felt what it means to be human." Sub-Commander Dron's forearms were shaking as he bent down to retrieve his dropped tablet. And when he looked at the scores displayed on the screen, he let out a noise that might have been a laugh or might have been terror. "The final wave," he said in a voice that cracked. She completed the final wave in under 3 minutes, the fastest time ever recorded for any species. And she did it with a combat form that does not exist in any of our databases, in the observation deck. Admiral Grace Lawson calmly walked to the intercom panel and pressed the transmit button. "Candidate Cole," she said, her voice carrying through the chamber speakers, "the trial is over. You can stand down now." Megan looked up at the platform where the instructors were slowly regaining their composure. And then she looked at the observation window where Admiral Lawson stood with Nathan Perry beside her. She did not understand what had happened or why the instructors had stopped moving, but she could see from their faces that something fundamental had changed. What happened to them? She called up to the Admiral. "They learned something important," Admiral Lawson replied. "And in a moment they are going to explain it to you." Commander Veltri stepped forward to the edge of the platform, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the dismissive boredom that had marked his earlier announcements. "Candidate Cole," he said, and there was something that might have been respect in his tone. "During your final wave, Overseer Yalith accidentally created a telepathic link between your mind and ours." He paused, and his scales shifted to a deep blue that Megan did not recognize. "We experienced your thoughts, your instincts, your survival drive, and I must tell you that in 300 years of training warriors, I have never felt anything like what we felt from you." Overseer Yalith moved to stand beside him, her pale face still drawn with the after effects of the psychic connection. "I have touched the minds of 1,000 species across this galaxy," she said softly, "and I believed I understood what drives creatures to fight and survive. But humans are different." She looked down at Megan with those large, dark eyes that now held something like wonder. "Your species evolved on a world that should have killed you 100 times over. And instead of dying, you adapted. You endured. You refused to accept defeat, even when every logical calculation said you could not win." Sub-Commander Dron stepped forward with his tablet still clutched in 2 of his 4 hands. "Our evaluation system is based on technique and form because those are the things that determine victory between civilized species," he said. "We measure how closely a candidate adheres to proven combat methods because those methods have been refined over thousands of years to maximize efficiency." He shook his head, his compound eyes still reflecting his disbelief. "But you do not fight to be efficient, you fight to survive." And when we felt what that means through the telepathic link, we understood something that terrified us. Commander Veltris nodded and spoke again. "Humans do not have natural weapons or armor or enhanced reflexes. And by our standards, you should be one of the weakest species in the galaxy." His scales shifted to that strange deep blue once more. "But evolution gave you something else instead. It gave you a psychology that refuses to acknowledge defeat. a mind that treats every fight as life or death, and the survival instinct that will find a way to win no matter how impossible the odds. He looked at his fellow instructors and then back down at Megan. When you stopped trying to match our combat forms and simply fought to survive, you became more dangerous than any opponent I have faced in 3 centuries of warfare. Megan stood in the chamber below, listening to these words that she had never expected to hear. And slowly she began to understand she had not failed the trial by fighting wrong. She had shown them something that their evaluation system was never designed to measure. I felt something else during the link, Overseer Yalith said quietly. Beneath the survival instinct and the determination there was something more. A kind of hope that I have rarely encountered. She tilted her head as if studying Megan from a new angle. You were not just fighting to survive. You were fighting because you believed you could win. Even when every number said otherwise, even when we had already declared you a failure. You believed. Admiral Lawson's voice came through the speakers once more. That is what makes humans dangerous. Overseer, we do not calculate odds the way other species do. We simply refuse to accept them. She stepped into view at the observation window. And for the first time, Megan could see that the Admiral was smiling. We have been waiting 15 years for the galaxy to understand what we truly are. And today, my candidate gave you a demonstration that no amount of words could ever match. Commander Veltris looked from the Admiral to Megan and back again. And something in his expression shifted as understanding dawned. You knew this would happen, he said slowly. You pushed for human inclusion in these trials, not because you thought we would pass by your standards, but because you wanted us to show you who we really are. Admiral Lawson's smile widened. Humanity learned a long time ago that actions speak louder than words, Commander. And now you understand why we never gave up, even when your evaluation criteria said we could not succeed. She met his gaze through the glass, because giving up is simply not something we know how to do. The fourth wave crashed against Megan like a tide of violence. And for the first few seconds, she fought the way she had been fighting all along. She blocked and dodged and struck back using the techniques she had learned, trying desperately to match the forms and patterns that the instructors wanted to see. But the enemies were too fast now, too coordinated, too perfect in their movements. Blades sliced across her ribs, and her suit registered critical damage. A fist connected with her jaw and sent her spinning across the floor. For one terrible moment, she lay there on the cold metal, staring up at the ceiling of the simulation chamber while holographic enemies closed in around her. And that was when something inside her finally broke. Not her spirit, not her courage, but something else entirely. It was the cage she had built around herself, the careful control she had maintained since the moment she stepped into this chamber, the desperate need to prove that she could fight the way they wanted her to fight. That cage shattered into a million pieces. And what emerged from the wreckage was something that had been sleeping in her blood since the first humans walked upright on a world that wanted them dead. Megan rose from the floor in a movement that looked nothing like any combat form in any galactic database. She did not assume up a stance or prepare a technique or calculate the optimal angle of attack. She simply moved. The first holographic enemy reached for her, and she was not there anymore, flowing around its attack like water around a stone and driving her fingers into the weak point where its neck met its shoulder. It vanished, and she was already moving to the next one, her body operating on instincts that predated civilization itself up on the platform. Sub-Commander Drawn's tablet began flashing with errors as the evaluation software struggled to categorize what it was seeing. What is she doing? He demanded, his compound eyes tracking her movement with growing confusion. This matches no known combat form. There is no technique here, no pattern, no predictable sequence. Commander Veltris leaned forward, his scales shifting to a color none of his colleagues had ever seen before. She is not fighting anymore, he said slowly. She is hunting, in the observation deck. Nathan Perry pressed his face against the glass as he watched his friend become something he did not recognize. Megan was everywhere at once, a blur of motion that left destroyed enemies in her wake. And there was nothing beautiful or elegant about what she was doing. It was brutal and efficient and absolutely terrifying. What the hell? He whispered. Admiral Lawson smiled for the first time since the trial began. There she is, the Admiral said quietly. There is the real thing. Below them, the fourth wave ended in half the time it should have taken, and the simulation system immediately launched a fifth and final wave without pause. This was the tier designed for species with natural armor and enhanced reflexes. The level that had broken candidates far stronger and faster than any human could ever hope to be. 20 enemies materialized around Megan in a perfect circle, each one armed with weapons that glowed with lethal energy. She stood in the center of them, breathing hard, her combat suit torn and flickering with damage warnings. And then she looked up at the instructors on their platform, and something in her eyes made Overseer Yaleth gasp. The Neruvian telepath had been monitoring Megan's mind throughout the trial, trying to understand human thought patterns. And now she felt something that defied everything she knew about psychology. It was not anger or determination or even survival instinct as she understood it. It was something far more ancient and terrible. It was the absolute certainty of a creature that had clawed its way to the top of a death world's food chain, a predator that did not know how to accept defeat, a mind that would adapt and overcome and keep fighting until either it won or it died trying. Yaleth tried to pull back from the mental contact, but found that she could not. And in her shock, she accidentally did something she had never done before. She created a telepathic link between Megan's mind and every other mind on the platform. Commander Veltris felt it first, a weight pressing against his thoughts that tasted like blood and fire and endless determination. But Commander Drawn dropped his tablet as his forearms went rigid, his compound eyes seeing something that existed only in his mind. Overseer Yaleth opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. They felt what Megan felt. They saw what Megan saw. And for the first time in their long lives, these warriors who had trained thousands of soldiers across dozens of species experienced what it truly meant to be human. It was a million years of evolution compressed into a single moment. The memories of ancestors who had hunted mammoths with stone spears and survived ice ages through sheer stubborn refusal to die was the knowledge that humans were soft and slow and weak compared to almost everything else that had ever tried to kill them, and the bone-deep certainty that none of that had ever stopped them before. It was the understanding that when a human stopped fighting to win and started fighting to survive, they became something that had no quit in them, no surrender, no concept of impossible odds. The instructors felt all of this crash through their minds like a tidal wave, and their bodies locked up in response to the primal terror that their hindbrains could not ignore. On the platform above the combat chamber, 3 of the most experienced combat instructors in the Galactic Defense Fleet stood frozen like statues while their eyes stared at nothing and their minds drowned in a single overwhelming truth. Humans were not the weak and clumsy newcomers they had believed. Humans were the survivors of a world that had tried to kill them for their entire existence as a species, and now one of those survivors was fighting for her life in the chamber below, and the instructors could feel every moment of it as if they were fighting alongside her in the observation deck. Nathan Perry saw the instructors go still and turned to Admiral Lawson with horror on his face. "They are not moving," he said. "Something is wrong." "They are not moving at all." Admiral Lawson watched the scene with an expression of perfect calm. "No," she agreed. "They are not. And when they start moving again, they will understand something that the galaxy has never realized about humanity. She turned to look at Nathan with pride burning in her eyes. We were never trying to pass their test. We were trying to show them why they need to write a new one. One day, after the trial that had shaken the foundations of everything the Galactic Defense Fleet believed about combat evaluation, Megan Cole was summoned to the main command center of Orbital 7. She walked through corridors that felt different now, and it took her a moment to realize why the aliens she passed were looking at her differently than before. There was no pity in their eyes anymore. No dismissive glances or quiet murmurs about the fragile human who did not belong among real warriors. Instead, she saw something that might have been curiosity, or caution, or perhaps even respect. The command center was a vast circular room with towering windows that looked out at the stars. And waiting for her, there was a gathering unlike anything she had expected. Commander Veltris stood at the center of the room alongside Sub-Commander Dron and Overseer Yalith. But they were not alone. Behind them stood a dozen other high-ranking officers from species across the galaxy, all of them watching Megan with expressions she could not quite read. Admiral Lawson stood to one side with Nathan Perry beside her, and she gave Megan a small nod of encouragement as she entered. "Candidate Cole," Commander Veltris began, and his voice carried none of the cold formality from the trial. "We have reviewed the recordings of your combat trial, as well as the biometric data captured from the instructors during the telepathic incident." He paused and looked at the other officers behind him before continuing. "What we witnessed has forced us to reconsider many things we believe to be true about combat, about evaluation, and about humanity." Sub-Commander Dron stepped forward with a datapad in his upper hands. "Our evaluation criteria have remained unchanged for over 3,000 years because they accurately predicted combat effectiveness across every species we encountered," he said. "But your trial revealed a critical flaw in our methodology." He held up the datapad so everyone could see the graphs and charts displayed on the screen. "We measure technique because technique determines the outcome of controlled combat between civilized opponents. But humans do not fight controlled combat." Overseer Yalith moved to stand beside him, her dark eyes fixed on Megan. "When I linked our minds during the trial, I understood something that our evaluation system could never capture," she said softly. "Humans do not see combat as a test of skill to be measured and graded. They see it as survival, as life or death, as something that must be won at any cost." She turned to address the assembled officers. "That psychological difference makes them more dangerous than any physical advantage, because a creature that refuses to accept defeat will find ways to win that no amount of training can prepare for." Commander Veltris nodded, and his scale shifted to that deep blue color that Megan now recognized as a sign of profound respect. "Candidate Cole," he said formally, "the Council of Instructors has voted to offer you a position within the Galactic Defense Fleet. But it is not the standard combat role you applied for." Megan felt her heart skip a beat as she waited for him to continue. "We want you to become an instructor," he said. "Specifically, we want you to help us develop a new training program that will teach other species what it means to fight like a human." The words hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment she could not speak. She had come here hoping to barely pass a combat trial, and now they were asking her to teach the galaxy how to fight. "I do not understand," she managed to say. "You saw my scores. I failed almost every category by your standards." "Yes," Commander Veltris agreed. "And that is precisely why we need you, because our standards were measuring the wrong things. And you showed us what we were missing." Admiral Lawson stepped forward with pride radiating from every line of her posture. "This is what Earth has been working toward for 15 years. Candidate Cole," she said, "we knew that humanity could not compete with species who had been training warriors for millennia. So instead, we decided to show the galaxy that there is more than one way to fight." She gestured at the assembled officers, who represented dozens of different worlds. These commanders have watched the recordings of your trial, and they have all reached the same conclusion. Humanity has something to offer that no other species possesses. Nathan Parry stepped forward to stand beside his friend, his eyes shining with excitement. "Megan, this is incredible," he said. "They want us to change how the entire fleet trains its warriors." "Us?" Megan repeated. Admiral Lawson smiled. "Nathan's trial is no longer necessary. The Council has already approved him as your assistant instructor based on what they observe from you. They believe that if one human can demonstrate these abilities, then others can be trained to access them as well." Overseer Yalith approached Megan and looked at her with those dark, unblinking eyes. "What you carry inside you is not something that can be taught through technique or form," she said quietly. "It is something deeper, something that your species earned through millions of years of surviving a world that tried to destroy you." She reached out and placed one pale hand on Megan's shoulder. "But perhaps you can teach other species to find that same fire within themselves, or at least to understand what they face when they stand against a human in battle." Commander Veltris cleared his throat and addressed the room. "Let it be recorded that on this day the Galactic Defense Fleet formally acknowledges humanity, not as provisional members learning to meet our standards, but as full partners with unique abilities that complement our existing forces." He turned to look at Megan, and there was something almost like warmth in his reptilian eyes. "We spent centuries believing that humans were fragile newcomers who had nothing to teach us about warfare," he said. "Today we accept that we were wrong, and we are honored to learn from those we once dismissed." Megan looked around the room at the faces of aliens who had doubted her, judged her, and written her off as a failure. Now they looked at her with the respect that humanity had been fighting to earn. "Since the day of first contact, I have one condition," she said finally. "Commander." Veltris tilted his head. "Name it." Megan smiled. And in that smile was the same fierce determination that had carried her through the trial when new human candidates arrive for training. "They do not have to pass your old evaluation," she said. "They take a new test, one that measures what we can actually do instead of forcing us to pretend to be something we are not." Commander Veltris exchanged glances with the other officers, and one by one they nodded. "Agreed," he said. "From this day forward, humans will be evaluated by human standards." He extended one clawed hand toward her in the gesture of respect that Talaxians reserve for worthy opponents. "Welcome to the Galactic Defense Fleet, Instructor Cole." Megan took his hand and shook it firmly. And in that moment she knew that everything had changed, not just for her, not just for Nathan, but for every human who would ever walk these corridors and take their place among the warriors of the stars behind her through the command center windows. A transport ship was arriving from Earth, carrying the next group of human candidates. They would never know the fear of being judged by standards they could not meet. They would never experience the despair of watching their scores drop while alien instructors shook their heads in disappointment. Instead, they would arrive to find something that had never existed before in the history of the galaxy. They would find a place that was ready to see them for what they truly were. And when they stepped off that transport and looked at the alien warriors around them, those warriors would look back with something new in their eyes. Not pity, not dismissal, not boredom, but respect.